Clara Whitfield's hands were shaking when she signed her name for the last time in the town of Millhaven. Not from cold, not from fear, from rage. Because the man sitting across the desk, the man who had just declared her a fraud in front of every soul she had ever trusted, was smiling. Walter Grayson folded his hands and said very calmly, "You have until sundown tomorrow, Mrs. Whitfield. After that, I cannot promise what the town will do." She looked him in the eye and said nothing. Some things don't deserve an answer. If this story already has your heart beating faster, hit that subscribe button right now, leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from, and follow along until the very end. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. She had $23, a worn leather suitcase with a broken clasp, and one photograph she would not let anyone take from her, not even if they pried her fingers apart one by one. That was all Clara Whitfield had left after 17 years of building something in Millhaven, Montana, 17 years of early mornings and late candles, of keeping ledgers for her husband's small general store, of making do when harvests were thin, of smiling at neighbors who now could not look her in the eye. She stood outside the doors of the Millhaven County office for a long moment before she turned around. She didn't look back at the building. She didn't look at the people who had gathered on the wooden sidewalk to watch her go. And there were people watching, because in a small town, there is always someone ready to witness a fall. She simply walked. Left foot, right foot. The kind of walking that isn't going anywhere. Just moving because stopping means breaking. Her name had been Clara Whitfield for 11 years, since the summer Thomas Whitfield had gotten down on one knee in his father's cornfield and offered her a ring that was slightly too big for her finger. She'd worn it anyway. Wore it loose and laughing, told him she'd grow into it. She hadn't. The ring had fallen off once in a creek, and Thomas waded in after it, boots and all, came back soaking and red-faced, and handed it back to her without a word. She'd buried that ring with him. Thomas died of pneumonia in the February of 1883. 3 days of high fever and then gone, like a candle someone pinched out between their fingers. No warning. No time to say the right things. Just gone. And that was when Millhaven changed. Or maybe Millhaven had always been what it was, and Thomas had simply been the wall she stood behind without knowing it. Because the moment the town found out she was alone, really alone, no brother, no father, no cousin to take responsibility, the shape of things shifted. Slowly at first. A coldness at the general store when she went to settle accounts. A hesitation when she spoke at community meetings. A particular silence that followed her name. Then Walter Grayson started calling on her. He came 3 times, each time dressed finely, sitting in her parlor with his hat in his hands, speaking in the measured, careful way of a man who considers every word an investment. He was 51 years old, wide in the shoulder, with the kind of face that had once been handsome and had curdled into something commanding. He owned the largest cattle operation in the valley. He owned 2 of the town's 4 businesses. He was, as people like to say, a man of considerable standing. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said on the first visit, "a woman in your position ought not be alone." "I'm not alone," Clara told him. "I have work. I have this house." "Work that could disappear," he said pleasantly. "A house you rent." She offered him coffee and showed him to the door. On the second visit, he was less pleasant. "I am making you a serious offer," he said. "You would want for nothing." "What I want," Clara said, "is to be left alone to manage my own affairs." "Your own affairs," Walter repeated. He said it the way people repeat something to show they find it amusing. "Clara, you don't have affairs anymore. Thomas's name was on everything. Without it. Good evening, Mr. Grayson." On the third visit, he didn't come to the door. He sent a letter. The letter was from the Millhaven Territorial Bank. It informed Clara that an audit of the late Thomas Whitfield's accounts had revealed discrepancies. That pending further investigation, her access to the joint accounts would be suspended. That she should contact the office of Mr. R. Halverson, attorney at law, to discuss her obligations. The letter was signed by a bank manager she had never met. She sat at her kitchen table for a long time after reading it. Then she folded it carefully, put it in her apron pocket, and went back to work. She fought it the only way she knew how. With paper. With figures. She had kept those accounts. She knew every transaction, every supplier, every debt paid and outstanding. She wrote it all out in careful columns, took it to the bank, asked for a meeting. The meeting was brief. The bank manager, a thin man named Pryor, who smelled of hair oil, listened politely and told her the matter was out of his hands. It had been referred to Mr. Grayson as the primary creditor of Millhaven's commercial district. Mr. Grayson, Clara said flatly, is not a creditor of the Whitfield store. Pryor looked at the papers in front of him with great interest. I'm afraid the documentation suggests otherwise, Mrs. Whitfield. That was when she understood. This was not about money. This was not about accounts or documentation or the law. This was Walter Grayson's answer to being told no. She went to the sheriff next. He listened to her in the way men listen to women. They have already decided they won't believe. Head slightly tilted, hands folded, the slow blink of someone waiting for the problem to stop talking. Now, Mrs. Whitfield, he said, Mr. Grayson is a man of considerable standing, she finished. Yes, I've been told. These are complex financial matters, perhaps with time. My landlord gave me 30 days, Clara said. I don't have time. The sheriff looked at the ceiling as if the answer might be written there. I'm sorry, ma'am. I don't see what I can do. She visited the minister. She visited the newspaper office. She sat across from the editor, a young man who had the face of someone who wanted to be brave but wasn't quite there yet, and laid out every piece of documentation she had. He looked at it for a long time. Mrs. Whitfield, he said finally, you understand that Mr. Grayson is our largest advertiser. She picked up her papers and left without answering him either. By the time the 30 days were up, Clara had run out of options and almost out of money. Her belongings had been moved to a boarding house room, then out of the boarding house when the owner's wife, a woman who had once called Clara a dear friend, told her apologetically that there had been some concerns raised about reputation and association, and she hoped Clara understood. Clara said she understood perfectly. She packed what fit in the suitcase. She left the rest on the front step of the boarding house without a word. She took the photograph. Thomas at 28, squinting in the sun, not looking at the camera, but at something just past it, laughing at something she couldn't remember anymore, but knew had been real. She walked out of Millhaven before sunrise on a Thursday morning in June of 1885. She didn't tell anyone she was leaving because there was no one left to tell. The road north into the mountains was not really a road. It was a suggestion of one, wagon ruts and horse tracks through grass that got thicker and taller as the valley fell away. Clara had no particular destination. She knew vaguely that there were ranches up in the high country, isolated operations run by men who preferred distance from town life. She thought, with a practicality that surprised even herself, that perhaps someone up there might need help, might not care about her name or her history, might just need hands that could work. If not, at least she would be somewhere Walter Grayson wasn't. She walked for most of the first day without stopping, except to drink from a stream and eat the 2 biscuits she'd wrapped in cloth that morning. Her feet were used to town distances, not mountain distances, and by early afternoon she was feeling the difference in ways that ran from her heels to the small of her back. But she kept walking. She was angry enough to keep walking. And she had discovered, in the weeks since Thomas's death, that anger was cleaner than grief. Grief made you soft and slow. Anger had edges. She could move along the edge of it like a blade, and it kept her going even when going made no rational sense. By the time the light turned golden and the pines had thickened to either side of her, Clara's shoes had given out at the left heel, and she was developing a limp she was trying not to think about. The mountain air was colder than she expected. She had a shawl, but not a proper coat, and the temperature dropped faster up here than in the valley. She had maybe another hour of light. She was thinking about where she might shelter for the night. A fallen log, a rock outcropping, anything with a windward side, when she smelled it. Wood smoke. She stood still for a moment and tilted her head. Yes. Wood smoke, and something that might be coffee. Real coffee, not the thin chicory kind, coming from somewhere through the trees to her left. Clara was not a woman who had ever considered herself brave in any dramatic sense. She was practical. She kept accounts. She fixed things that broke. But walking toward an unknown fire in a darkening wilderness, toward a man she had never seen, carrying everything she owned in a broken suitcase, she understood clearly that this was a moment where the wrong decision meant not surviving the night. She weighed it the way she weighed everything. Risk of the fire, unknown. Risk of the mountain without shelter, certain. She turned left. He heard her before he saw her. She was sure of that. Because when she came through the last stand of pines into a small clearing where a fire burned steadily between a ring of river stones, the man sitting beside it was already looking in her direction. He didn't startle, didn't reach for the rifle she could see leaning against the tree behind him. He simply watched her come. I was lean in the way of men who work hard and eat when they have time. Dark hair going gray at his temples, dark eyes and a face weathered to something beyond age. Not old exactly, but permanent, like the bark of a tree that has survived a number of things it wasn't designed to. He wore a dark vest over a rolled-sleeve shirt despite the cold, and his hat was pushed back slightly on his head in the manner of someone who has spent so many years outdoors that shelter from elements is something he applies to other people. He said nothing. Clara stopped at the edge of the firelight. She was aware, suddenly, of how she must look. Tired in a way that goes past tired, shoes broken, the hem of her dress muddy from a creek crossing she'd misjudged 2 hours back. She thought about pride, briefly, and then she thought about the cold coming. "May I warm up by your fire?" she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. She was glad of that. The man looked at her for a moment. Then he looked past her, at the tree line, the way she'd come. "You alone?" he asked. "Yes." "Walking from Millhaven?" She didn't ask how he knew. "Yes." He was quiet for another beat. Then he moved. Not away from her, but sideways, making room on the log he sat on. It was a simple gesture, wordless and direct. "Sit down," he said. "You look like you've walked farther than most people would survive." Clara Whitfield sat down beside his fire. She didn't cry, though she had the feeling she might later, when she was alone enough for it. Right now she held herself together through sheer stubbornness, held her hands out to the flame, and let the heat work into her fingers. "I'm Clara Whitfield," she said, because it seemed right to give him that. "Ethan Callahan," he said. He poured coffee from a battered tin pot into a cup and held it toward her without ceremony. She took it. "Thank you." "You eat today?" "Some." He reached behind the log without comment and produced a cloth-wrapped bundle. Dried meat, hard bread, something that turned out to be a piece of cold-boiled potato. He set it on the log between them. Clara looked at it, then at him. "You always feed strangers who walk out of the dark?" "Not usually," Ethan said. "You don't look like most strangers who walk out of the dark." "What do I look like?" I was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. "Like somebody who made a decision and then kept it," he said, "even when it got hard." She ate. She drank the coffee. The fire was good, and the night settled around them, and neither of them spoke much for a while, which she found she didn't mind. In her experience, men who talked constantly in the presence of a woman they didn't know were almost always talking about themselves. This man seemed comfortable with silence, the way you're comfortable with something you've spent a long time learning to live with. After a while she said, "I'm not looking for charity." "Didn't figure you were." "I need work, real work. I can cook, I can ride, though I'm better at some horses than others. I can keep accounts. I've kept ledgers for years. I can learn most things I don't already know." Ethan said nothing for a moment. He turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands. Then, "My ranch is about 2 miles up the ridge. I've been running it alone for 3 years. It's not comfortable work. Mountain weather's unpredictable, and the cattle don't care about your situation." "I'm not looking for comfortable," Clara said. "I'm not offering it," he said. "What I'm offering is a fair day's wage and a room in the main house that's been empty long enough to need airing out." He paused. "You'd have to earn it the same way anybody else would. No special allowances. I wouldn't want them." "Then we can see how it goes," he said. He looked at her directly for the first time, not the glancing assessment he'd been giving her, but a real look, the kind that measures. "I'll tell you one thing about this mountain, Mrs. Whitfield. Nobody up here cares what they said about you in town. The only thing that'll matter is what you do." Clara looked back at him with the same steadiness. "Then I'll do plenty," she said. The fire snapped. An ember drifted upward into the dark. Somewhere above them in the pines, an owl called once and went quiet. And Clara Whitfield, who had walked away from everything she knew with $23 and a photograph and nothing else, felt something she hadn't felt in months. Not safe, exactly. Not rescued. She would never use that word. She didn't want to be rescued. She wanted to stand on her own ground. But for the first time since Thomas died, she felt something like possibility. Like a door that hasn't been opened yet, rather than one that's been closed behind her. Ethan Callahan kicked dirt over the edge of the fire and stood. "Best sleep before the work starts," he said. "Up here it starts early." "I'm ready for early," Clara said. And she meant it. Down in the valley, in the large house at the center of his land, Walter Grayson sat at his desk with a glass of whiskey and a clear conscience. He had dealt with Clara Whitfield the way he dealt with everything that refused to cooperate. Methodically, completely, and without visible fingerprints. He had expected by now to hear she'd left the territory entirely. Gone east to family, or gone west to nothing. He had not expected her to go north. He would not learn that she had for another 3 weeks. And when he did, the name Ethan Callahan would make something move across his face that wasn't quite an expression. Something tighter and colder than anger. Something closer to the realization that he had underestimated someone. That was not a feeling Walter Grayson was accustomed to, and he did not handle it gracefully. But that was still 3 weeks away. Tonight, on the mountain, Clara Whitfield followed a stranger up a dark ridge path with her broken suitcase in her hand, and her head level, and her jaw set. The way a woman sets her jaw when she has decided that what comes next is going to be different. Not easier. Different. And sometimes different is enough to start with. The pine trees rose around her on both sides, tall and certain, and the stars overhead were thick the way they never were in town. And the cold was real and specific and alive in a way that felt, somehow, more honest than any room she had been asked to leave. Ethan walked ahead of her without rushing, without looking back to check on her, which she respected more than she could have explained. He trusted her to keep up. So she did. Behind her, at the foot of the mountain and far below the stars, Millhaven glowed with its small settled lights. It looked, from up here, very small indeed. The morning came fast on the mountain. Clara learned that in the first 5 minutes of her first full day at Ethan Callahan's ranch, when something heavy landed on the wooden floor outside her door and a voice said flatly from the other side of it, "Sun's up, coffee's on." That was the entirety of the wake-up call. No knock. No "Good morning, Mrs. Whitfield." Just the sound of boots walking away down the hall and the distant clatter of a cast-iron pan hitting a stove. She sat up in the narrow bed and looked at the gray light coming through the single window. Her body ached in ways she hadn't felt since the early years of marriage, when she and Thomas had done their own heavy lifting before they could afford help. Her left heel was raw where the shoe had given out. Her shoulders were stiff from the cold and from holding herself together the night before with pure nerve. She got up anyway. The room was small and plain. A bed, a washstand, a hook on the wall. The air smelled of pine resin and an old wood, and something underneath both of those that she recognized after a moment as absence. The smell of a room that has not been lived in for a long time. She washed her face with water from the basin, pinned her hair as neatly as she could manage, and put on the cleanest dress she had left. Then she walked out to meet whatever this was going to be. Ethan was standing at the stove with his back to her when she came into the kitchen. He didn't turn around. He poured a second cup of coffee and set it on the table without looking. The way you set something down in a house you know well enough to navigate without thinking. "Cattle need moving to the north pasture before noon," he said. "Fence on the east side has a post that's been leaning since April. 2 of the horses need their shoes checked. The gray one's been favoring his left front for a week. And the supply shed inventory hasn't been counted since February." Clara sat down and wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. Which do you want me to start with? He turned then. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her the night before. That measuring look, like he was calculating the weight of something. You said you could ride. I can ride. The North Pasture move requires someone who can actually ride, not someone who sat on a horse at a church fair once. I grew up in Missouri, Clara said. My father kept horses. I've been riding since I was 7. She paused. I'll admit I haven't done it in a few years, but a person doesn't forget. Something shifted slightly in his expression. Not softening exactly. More like the adjustment you make when a measurement comes in different than you expected. All right, he said. You're on the pasture move. I'll take the east fence. He put a plate in front of her, beans, bacon, 2 biscuits, and poured himself more coffee, and that was breakfast. No conversation, no pleasantries. He ate standing at the counter, looking out the window at something she couldn't see, and she ate at the table and didn't try to fill the silence. She was good at silence when she needed to be. Thomas had been a talker, warm and easy and quick to laugh, and she had loved that about him. But she had also learned that quiet was not the same as cold. This man's quiet was not cold. It was occupied. She washed the dishes while he went out to saddle the horses. She dried them and put them away in the places that made sense. Not because he asked her to, but because she was not the kind of person who left dishes wet on a counter when she had 2 hands and a drying cloth. She found the correct place for each thing by looking at what was already there and following its logic. When she came out to the yard, he had 2 horses saddled and waiting. The one he handed her the reins to was a chestnut mare with a level eye and a steady stance. A working horse, not a show horse. Clara put her foot in the stirrup and swung up and settled her weight, and the mare stood perfectly still and waited. Ethan watched this. He said nothing, but he turned his horse toward the north without the slight hesitation she'd half expected. The one that would mean he was deciding whether to second-guess himself about sending her alone. He just turned and rode, and she followed, and they worked the cattle together for 3 hours in the high pasture without anything going dramatically wrong. Clara made mistakes. She knew it. There was a moment where she pushed the herd from the wrong angle and 3 cows broke left, and she had to recover hard, wheeling the mare around and cutting back before the gap widened. She felt her heart kick hard in her chest. She felt Ethan's eyes on her from across the pasture. She fixed it, got the 3 cows back in line, closed the gap, kept her face neutral about the whole business. Her hands were shaking slightly by the time she got the mare settled, but her hands were her own business. When they closed the gate on the north pasture and the work was done, Ethan rode up alongside her and stopped. You pushed from the wrong side on the back 3, he said. I know, Clara said. They'll go left every time if you come at them from that angle. Come from the right, give them one direction. I'll remember. He looked at her for a moment. You fixed it fast, he said. She looked back at him. I try not to repeat my mistakes more than once. Something that might have been the very beginning of a smile moved through his expression and disappeared. He turned his horse back toward the ranch. Supply shed inventories next, he called back. Counting everything. Nothing gets skipped. I know how to count, Clara said. I'm starting to believe that, he said. She followed him back, and the morning had moved into afternoon, and she was tired in a way that felt clean for the first time in months. The supply shed took 2 hours and turned up 3 things nobody had known were missing, and 1 thing nobody had known they had. Clara wrote everything down in a ledger she found on the shelf, in the careful column-keeping hand she'd spent 11 years developing for the store. When she was done, she brought it to Ethan at the fence line, where he was still working on the east post. He looked at it for a long moment. You write a clean hand, he said. My father was a school teacher, Clara said. Clean handwriting was non-negotiable. Ethan handed the ledger back. Go check the gray horse. He's in the second stall. Tell me what you think about that left front. Clara went. She found the gray horse, a big animal, quiet but watchful, and ran her hands carefully down his left front leg, the way her father had taught her years ago, feeling for heat and swelling. She found both, just above the fetlock. She went back to Ethan. There's heat and swelling above the fetlock on the left front, she said. Might be a minor strain. He needs rest and cold compresses for a few days. No riding. Ethan's expression sharpened. You sure? That's what my father would have said. He kept 8 horses. She paused. I'm not a horse doctor, but I'm not guessing either. He put down his fence tools and went to check for himself. She heard him moving in the stall, heard the quiet sound of him talking to the horse in a low voice. Not words exactly, just the kind of murmured sound that settles an animal. He came back out 3 minutes later. Heat and swelling, just like you said. He looked at her with an expression that had recalculated something. You'd have made a fair ranch hand if you'd been raised to it. I was raised to whatever needed doing, Clara said. That night at supper, he didn't eat standing at the counter. He sat at the table. Clara noticed this and said nothing about it. The days settled into a pattern that was harder than anything she had done in years, and more straightforward than anything she had done in months. The work on the ranch didn't care about her history, or her reputation, or what Walter Grayson had put in the bank's records. The cattle didn't care. The horses didn't care. The fence posts certainly didn't. Every morning, Ethan told her what needed doing, and she did it. Some days she did it well, and some days she made mistakes, and some days she made mistakes, and then fixed them, and some days she didn't fix them entirely and had to try again the next day. I was not an easy man to work for. He expected competence and had little patience for complaints and almost none for excuses. But he was also, she noticed, scrupulously fair. He didn't hold yesterday's mistake against today. He didn't ask for more than was reasonable. And when she did something right, when she handled a difficult situation with the cattle, or found a smarter way to organize the supply rotation, or caught something he'd missed, he said so. Not effusively, not in a way designed to make her feel good, just a flat, direct acknowledgement. That's better, he said once, watching her work the gray horse through his recovery exercises with exactly the right pressure. Not too much, not too little. 2 words. But she carried them the rest of the day. She started to understand the shape of his silence, the way you understand the weather patterns of a particular place after you've lived in them long enough. There was the silence that meant he was thinking something through. The silence that meant he'd heard you and was considering it. The silence that meant the conversation was over. And occasionally, rarely, the silence that wasn't really silence. That was something else, something that sat between them in the space above a meal or at the end of a long day's work, that she didn't have a word for yet and wasn't ready to name. She had been at the ranch for almost 2 weeks when she found the photograph. She wasn't snooping, she was cleaning. He'd asked her to air out the front room, which had apparently not been properly opened in a very long time, and she moved a stack of books to get to a shelf, and a small framed photograph fell out from between them and landed face up on the floor. A woman and a small boy. The woman was young, maybe 25, with dark hair and an expression that was warm and direct and entirely alive. The boy was maybe 4 or 5, serious-faced, with his father's eyes. Clara picked it up carefully. She looked at it for a moment. She set it back where it had come from, face down, exactly as she'd found it. She didn't tell Ethan she'd seen it, but she understood something she hadn't fully understood before. The silence on this ranch had not started as a preference. It had started as a wound. A man did not become this practiced at solitude by choice. He became it the way you become anything that keeps you alive, out of sheer necessity, repeated until it became habit, then character. She was more careful with him after that. Not softer. He would have noticed soft and been made uncomfortable by it. But more careful. The way you're careful with something that has been broken and mended and doesn't need to be tested. 2 days later, Ethan asked her a question he hadn't asked before. They were finishing supper, and she had started clearing the plates, and he said, without looking up, "What did Grayson want with you specifically? He goes after plenty of people in that valley, but the way you described it, that wasn't business." Clara was still for a moment. Then she put the plates down and sat back at the table. "He wanted to marry me," she said. Ethan looked up. "He came 3 times, she said. Each time he was a little less polite about the offer. When I said no the 3rd time, he went after everything Thomas had built." She kept her voice even. "He's not a man who takes no for an answer. I think he believed I'd either give in or disappear. Either result would have satisfied him. He underestimated you, Ethan said. Most people do, Clara said. I've stopped taking it personally. Ethan was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee cup slowly. Walter Grayson, he said, has had his eye on the water rights in the Upper Valley for 10 years. Your husband's property sat on one of the main creek lines. Clara felt something tighten in her chest. I didn't know that. Most people don't, because he goes after the people and not the land directly. Easier to buy property cheap from a widow in trouble than to fight a man who knows what he's got. The word widow. She hadn't heard it said plainly in a while. It hit differently than she expected. He won't have gotten everything, she said carefully. Thomas registered the creek easement separately. I remember because the lawyer made a fuss about the paperwork. Ethan looked at her. You have documentation of that? I have everything, Clara said. Every piece of paper Thomas ever filed is in the bottom of that suitcase. I took it all before I left because I knew. She stopped. I knew I'd need it eventually. You knew you were going to fight him, Ethan said. Not a question. I knew I wasn't going to let him have everything, Clara said. Those are not the same thing, but yes, eventually. Ethan nodded, once, slowly. Then he picked up his coffee cup again and drank, and the subject seemed to close. But something had shifted in the room, the way the temperature shifts just before weather comes. Not dramatic yet, but different. She felt it. She suspected he did too. 3 days after that conversation, Walter Grayson's influence arrived on the mountain for the first time. It came in the form of a man named Briggs, one of Grayson's ranch hands, broad-shouldered and slow-moving in the deliberate way of someone who is used to people stepping out of his path. He rode up to the ranch gate in the middle of a Tuesday morning and waited there without dismounting, which was its own kind of statement. Clara was working at the supply shed when she saw him. She stopped what she was doing and stood where she was. She had learned, in the past weeks, to read the particular tension that moved through Ethan's body when something on his ranch wasn't right. She'd seen it twice, once with a sick calf, once with a section of fence that turned out to have been deliberately cut rather than broken by weather. She recognized it from across the yard. Ethan walked toward the gate. He didn't hurry, and he didn't slow down. Briggs, he said. Callahan. The big man looked past him, at Clara. He looked at her for a beat too long. Mr. Grayson heard you had a new ranch hand. Mr. Grayson keeps track of my staffing arrangements, does he? Mr. Grayson keeps track of a lot of things. Briggs smiled, but it was the kind of smile that's just teeth. He wanted me to pass along that the woman you've taken on, Mrs. Whitfield, is a person of some legal concern. Fraud allegations, bank dispute. He thought you should know what you've got working for you is all. Clara had been moving toward the gate while he spoke, and she was close enough now to hear every word. She stopped. She kept her face neutral through an act of will that cost her something. Ethan didn't move. I appreciate Mr. Grayson's concern, he said, in a tone that suggested he appreciated it not at all. Tell him I manage my own affairs. He's also saying, Briggs continued, as if Ethan hadn't spoken, that the water access you've been using on the South Creek line, the one that crosses Old Henderson land, might not be as settled as you think. Apparently there are questions about the filing. That landed differently. Clara saw it land. A slight change in Ethan's posture, the kind of change only someone who'd been watching him for weeks would notice. He knew what that meant. Water rights on a mountain ranch were not abstract. They were survival. Tell Mr. Grayson, Ethan said, that if he has concerns about any filings, he's welcome to take them to the county office, in writing, through the proper channels. A pause. That's what you want me to tell him. That's all I have to say to him, Ethan said. Safe ride back down, Briggs. Briggs looked past him at Clara again for a moment. Then he turned his horse and rode back down the mountain without another word. Ethan stood at the gate until the man was out of sight. Then he turned and walked back toward the house. He passed Clara without stopping, went inside, and came out 2 minutes later with his hat and his coat. I need to check the South Creek line, he said. I'll come with you, Clara said. He looked at her. She looked back at him. "All right," he said. They walked the creek line for 2 hours, checking every marker, every post, every point where the water access had been documented. Ethan knew the land well. He'd been on it for 8 years. And as he walked, he talked, explaining the history of the water rights, the Henderson filing, the original deed boundaries. Clara listened and asked specific questions, and he answered them. At one point he stopped and looked at her. "You understand land law?" "Some," she said. "Thomas dealt with county filings. I helped him. I learned more than I probably needed to at the time." "You might need all of it," Ethan said. "I know," Clara said. They stood at the creek for a moment. The water ran over the rocks, and the afternoon light caught it, and the sound of it was clean and constant and entirely unconcerned with any of their problems. "Grayson wants both," Clara said. "Your water rights and what's left of Thomas's easement. That's why he came after me first, because if he could force me off the land and discredit the filing, he'd have a clear run at the creek line without having to deal with you directly." Ethan was quiet. "He didn't know I'd come up here," she continued, "or that you'd let me stay. Now he does, and now he knows you're connected to it, and that makes you a problem for him too." She looked at him. "I'm sorry. That's my fault." "No," Ethan said. "It's Grayson's fault. There's a difference." He turned back toward the ranch. "Come on. We've got 2 hours of daylight left, and I want the south fence checked before dark." She caught up and walked beside him, and the conversation was over. The way his conversations always ended. Not with resolution, but with the next task, the next concrete thing that needed doing, which she had come to understand was not avoidance, but the way he processed things, by moving through them. They worked the fence line until the light failed. When they got back to the ranch, supper was late, and they ate it in a silence that was different from their usual silence. Fuller, somehow, weighted with the shape of what was coming. After supper, Clara brought the suitcase to the kitchen table. She opened it and took out the folder of papers that had been sitting at the bottom since she packed it, the night before she walked out of Millhaven. She spread them on the table: the store accounts, the property records, the creek easement filing, the original deed from Thomas's father, the letter from the bank, the correspondence she'd kept from the lawyer. Ethan looked at the stack of papers for a long moment. Then he pulled his chair around to her side of the table. "Show me," he said. They sat side by side at the kitchen table for 2 hours, going through every piece of documentation. Clara explained what each paper was, what it proved, where the gaps were, what would need to be verified. Ethan asked sharp, specific questions that told her he understood land law better than he let on. She answered every question. When she didn't know something, she said so. When she was certain, she said so. At the end of 2 hours, they had a clear picture of what they had, what was missing, and what Walter Grayson had almost certainly already moved to obscure. "This easement," Ethan said, pointing to the creek filing. "If this is still valid, and it might be, because he'd have had to challenge it formally to invalidate it, and there'd be a record, then Grayson's entire water strategy in the Upper Valley falls apart. He can't control the South Creek if the Whitfield easement stands. Which is why he needed me gone and discredited before anyone looked too closely," Clara said. "And why he needs me either bought or neutralized," Ethan said. Clara looked at the papers on the table. "Do you know anyone at the county office? Someone honest?" Ethan considered. "There's a land registrar named Hoffman. I've dealt with him twice. He's not for sale." A pause. "Far as I can tell." "We need to get to him before Grayson does," Clara said. Ethan nodded. He began carefully stacking the papers back into order, handling them with a precision that matched hers. "I'll ride to the county seat on Thursday," he said. 2-day ride there and back. I need someone to run the ranch." He said it without looking at her, but she felt the full weight of what was in the sentence. "I can run the ranch," Clara said. He looked up. "For 2 days? Alone?" "You know I can," she said. "You've been watching me for 2 weeks." He held her gaze for a moment, then, "All right, Ethan." She waited until he looked at her again. "Be careful. If Grayson finds out you're going to the county office—" "He'll find out," Ethan said. "A man like that always finds out. The question is whether we move fast enough that it doesn't matter." "Then move fast," she said. He almost smiled. It wasn't quite there, but it was in the neighborhood of one, something that passed through his face and left the air slightly different in its wake. "Get some sleep," he said. "Ranch doesn't know it's Tuesday." She went to bed. She lay in the narrow room and stared at the ceiling and listened to the ranch settle around her. The horses in the barn, the cattle on the north pasture, the wind moving through the pines the way it always did, steady and certain. She thought about Walter Grayson sitting in his comfortable house in the valley and deciding, when he received Briggs's report, that the situation needed to be managed more directly. She thought about the bank manager with his hair oil and his documents. She thought about the sheriff with his folded hands and his careful non-hearing. She thought about a system built entirely to make people like her disappear. And how, if you disappeared quietly, it worked perfectly. And how the one thing it hadn't counted on was a woman who walked into the dark instead of down. On Thursday morning, Ethan loaded his saddlebags with the copies she'd made of the relevant documents. She'd spent Wednesday evening writing them out twice in her careful hand, original and copy, and he rode out before full light. He stopped at the gate and turned. "Lock the barn at night," he said. "Don't let anyone in the house you don't know." "I know," she said. "And if Briggs comes back—" "I'll handle it," Clara said. He looked at her for a moment. The gray early light was behind him, and his face was in shadow, and he looked, for just a second, like a man who was used to leaving people and not coming back to the same situation he'd left. "I'll be back Saturday," he said. "I'll be here," she said. He rode out. She watched him go until the sound of hooves faded into the trees, and then she turned back to the ranch and everything that needed doing in it, and she did not stand there watching the empty road. That was not who she was. The first day alone went smoothly. She moved through the routine Ethan had established with the efficiency of someone who had been learning it for 2 weeks and now had to perform it alone. The cattle were fine. The horses were fine. The gray horse's leg was improving. The swelling was down. And she spent 20 minutes with him in the morning, working through the recovery exercises with the patience her father had taught her. In the evening, she sat at the kitchen table with the papers again, going over everything, looking for the thing she'd missed. There was always a thing she'd missed. In 11 years of keeping accounts, she had learned that a clean set of books was a set of books where you'd found the error, not one where there wasn't any. She found it just before 9 o'clock. It was in the original deed documentation from Thomas's father, a property boundary description that didn't match the survey markers on file at the county. A small difference. A casual reader would miss it entirely. Clara had nearly missed it herself, but she'd been a careful reader for a long time. She sat and stared at it. Then she got up and walked around the kitchen table once, the way she did when she was thinking hard. Then she sat back down. If the boundary description was different from the survey markers, and if the survey markers were the ones filed at the county, and if Walter Grayson had access to the county records, which he certainly did, then he might already have flagged this discrepancy, might already be preparing to use it to challenge the easement, or he might not have found it yet. Either way, she needed to know which survey was accurate, and for that she needed the original survey stakes, in the dark, alone, on a mountain. She thought about this for a moment. Then she got up, put on her coat, took the lantern, and went out. It took her an hour and a half to find the survey stake on the south pasture boundary. She found it by following the property description in the deed to the letter, measuring by pace and landmark the way she'd seen Thomas do once with a stubborn piece of farmland in Missouri. She was cold, and her lantern was burning low, and she'd tripped twice on ground she couldn't see properly. But she found it. And the stake was in a different place than the county survey markers suggested. Not different by chance. Different with a precision that said someone had measured it and recorded it wrong. Not by accident. She stood in the dark pasture with her lantern and the cold mountain wind and the certain, cold knowledge of what this meant. Someone had falsified the survey. Someone, or someone's hired hand, had altered the county records to shift the apparent boundary of the Whitfield property in a way that would eliminate the creek easement. And if Ethan arrived at the county office on Friday and asked to see the current registered survey without knowing this, he would be walking into a document that had already been altered to show something that wasn't true. She needed to tell him. But Ethan was a day's ride away, and she had no way to reach him. She stood in the dark pasture and thought. Then she did what she always did when the situation was worse than she'd expected, and there was no one to hand it to. She went back inside. She sat at the table. She took out the ledger she'd been keeping since her first day on the ranch. She turned to a clean page, and she started writing everything down. Every measurement, every discrepancy, every piece of the picture that connected back to Walter Grayson's name. If she had it in writing, if she had it documented, clear and specific and dated, then even if Ethan walked into the county office without knowing about the falsified survey, the documentation she was building would be the thing that mattered when the truth came out. She wrote until the lantern ran low and the night was nearly gone. When she finally stopped, her hand was cramped and her eyes were burning, and she had 17 pages of the most careful, precise, thorough documentation she had ever produced in her life. She put it with the other papers. She went to bed for 2 hours, and when the sun came up, she got up and ran the ranch. Because that was what she had said she could do, and she was not a woman who said things she didn't mean. Ethan came back on Saturday exactly when he said he would. Clara heard the horse before she saw him, the particular sound of his animal's gait on the rocky upper trail, which she had learned to distinguish from the other sounds the mountain made. She was at the barn when he rode in, and she watched his face as he dismounted, and she knew before he said a word that something had gone wrong. Not everything, but something. He unsaddled the horse in silence. She waited. She had learned that pushing Ethan Callahan toward words before he was ready to speak them was like pushing a boulder. You could exhaust yourself on it, and it wouldn't move an inch. Finally, he turned around and looked at her. "The survey on file at the county office," he said. "It's been amended." "I know," Clara said. He went still. "You know. I found the original survey stake 2 nights ago. The boundary markers don't match what's been filed. Someone altered the county record." She paused. "I wrote it all down. Measurements, discrepancies, everything. 17 pages. It's on the kitchen table." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. The kind of look that recalculates several things at once. "Come inside," he said. They sat at the kitchen table, and she walked him through everything. The discrepancy she'd found, the measurements she'd taken in the dark, the 17 pages she'd produced before dawn. He read every page slowly, the way he did everything, without rushing it. He asked 3 questions. She answered all 3. When he was done, he set the pages down flat on the table and pressed his hand against them. "The registrar, Hoffman. He wasn't at the office," Ethan said. "His assistant told me he'd been called away on personal business. Unexpected. 2 days prior." He looked at her. "The assistant offered to pull the survey records himself." "And you let him?" "I let him, because I didn't know then what you'd found." His jaw tightened. "The survey he showed me had the amended boundary already in it. Looked official. Looked like it had always been that way." "But you knew something was wrong," Clara said. It wasn't a question. "I knew something was wrong," he confirmed. "I've walked that south pasture line 8 years. The boundary he showed me was off. I just didn't have evidence of how or when it was changed." He gestured at her 17 pages. "Now I do," he said. Clara felt something move through her chest. Not quite relief, because the situation was still dangerous and getting more so, but something adjacent to it. The feeling of 2 pieces of a problem connecting. "Grayson moved Hoffman out of the way," she said, "so his man could show you the falsified survey without someone honest in the room to question it." "That's what I think," Ethan said. "Which means he knew you were coming." "Which means he knew I was coming," Ethan agreed. They looked at each other across the kitchen table, and the weight of that settled between them. Walter Grayson had eyes on this mountain. Had known Ethan was riding to the county seat before Ethan had gotten there. Had arranged the board before the game was played. That was not the work of a man who was reacting. That was the work of a man who had been planning. "How long has he wanted this land?" Clara asked. Ethan leaned back in his chair. Henderson, the man I bought this ranch from. He had a falling out with Grayson about 12 years ago. Water dispute in the Upper Valley. Henderson filed the easement that later passed with the property when I bought it. Grayson never accepted that filing as legitimate. He paused. He's been waiting for the right moment to challenge it since before I ever got here. And I walked into his valley and gave him the perfect distraction, Clara said. Quiet. Not self-pitying, just accurate. He used me to pull your attention toward my situation while he moved on the county records. Stop, Ethan said. She looked at him. You didn't give him anything, he said. He made his moves. He would have made them regardless. What you did was find the evidence that proves he made them. His voice was flat and certain. That's not the same thing as blame. Clara was quiet for a moment. You're very clear about where responsibility sits, she said. I've had time to think about it, he said. He didn't elaborate, but she understood. A man who had spent 3 years alone on a mountain had thought through more than most people did in 10 years of company. He'd had nothing to do but work and think, and he'd become precise about both. She picked up her 17 pages and squared them neatly. We need Hoffman, she said. The real one, not his assistant. I know. And we need someone who can verify the original survey stake against my measurements. She thought for a moment. Is there a land surveyor in the county who isn't in Grayson's pocket? One. Man named Aldrich. He's old and he's slow, and he doesn't particularly like making enemies. Ethan paused. But he's honest. Then we need him to come up here before Grayson can get to him too, Clara said. I can ride for him Monday morning. What about Hoffman? Hoffman's brother-in-law runs a livery in the county seat. I know his name. Ethan stood up. I'll send a letter tonight. If Hoffman gets it before Grayson's people find him. He needs to know what's in those records before he goes back to his office, Clara said. If he walks in not knowing, Grayson's man will have time to manage him. I'll write it tonight, Ethan said. He did. Clara sat at the table and wrote her own letter. To the county judge, a formal filing of notice that a survey discrepancy had been identified and that original documentation existed. Ethan watched her write it and said nothing until she was done, and then he read it and handed it back. That's exactly right, he said. And the way he said it, not surprised, just certain, meant more to her than she could have explained. They sent both letters with a ranch hand from a neighboring property who owed Ethan a favor and who rode out before dark. Then they ate supper and went to bed, and neither of them said anything about how close the whole thing was, how much still could go wrong, how many pieces were still unprotected. Sunday was quiet. Too quiet, in the specific way that a mountain is quiet when something is wrong. Clara noticed it first. The cattle on the north pasture were restless, moving in tight clusters, turning in the same direction repeatedly. She watched them from the fence and felt the small cold knot of attention that she'd developed in the weeks of ranch work, the animal awareness that a place you know well is behaving differently than it should. She got Ethan. He looked at the cattle for 30 seconds. Then he looked at the sky, and then he looked south, at a smear of brown-gray haze that had been building since morning. Fire, he said. Not close. Not yet. But coming. The fire had started somewhere in the dry grass of the lower valley. She found out later it was a spark from a careless campfire on the Henderson land, now vacant. In August, with weeks of dry heat and wind coming from the south, it didn't stay small for long. What happened in the next 4 hours was the most physically demanding thing Clara Whitfield had ever done in her life. Ethan gave orders fast, and she followed them faster. They moved the cattle from the north pasture to the high eastern field, the least exposed position on the ranch, and that alone took an hour of hard riding that left Clara's arms burning and her voice raw from calling. The gray horse couldn't work, so she took the chestnut mare hard, and the mare gave her everything she had. Halfway through the cattle move, one of the lead steers broke away from the herd and ran south, directly toward the fire's edge. Clara didn't think. She turned the mare and went after him at full gallop, riding into the hot wind with the smell of smoke thickening around her, closing the gap on the steer by sheer determination and the mare's stamina. She cut him off 50 yards from the fire line, turned him hard, drove him back toward the herd. When she got back, Ethan looked at her. Just one look. But she understood what was in it. After the cattle, the horses. After the horses, the supply shed. They carried everything flammable out and away from the main structure. Clara worked alongside Ethan without stopping, without slowing, without waiting to be told what came next. She could read the situation now, the way she read ledgers, following the logic of it, seeing what came after what. The fire crested below the ranch line and held there, starved by a stretch of rocky ground that gave it nothing to eat. It did not reach them. By late afternoon, the worst of it had burned itself out, and the wind shifted, and the smoke began to thin. They stood in the yard, and Clara's hands were shaking, not from fear anymore, but from the pure exhaustion of 4 hours of emergency work. Her dress was scorched at the hem. She had a burn on her left forearm from a cinder she hadn't moved fast enough to avoid. Not deep, but real. And she hadn't mentioned it because there hadn't been time, and because there were other things to address first. Ethan was the one who noticed it. He crossed the yard without comment and took her arm and looked at the burn. His hands were completely steady. He didn't make a sound, but something moved through his face. Something that tightened briefly and then resolved into action, the way everything resolved into action with him. "Come inside," he said. He cleaned and wrapped the burn with the same precision he applied to everything. Clara sat at the kitchen table and let him, and didn't argue, which she suspected surprised him. She was too tired to argue, and there was something in being taken care of, practically, competently, without sentiment, that she could accept when she was too tired to be proud about it. "You went after that steer," he said, not looking up from her arm. "He was going toward the fire." "I know, I saw you go." A pause. "That was dangerous," he said. "The steer was worth more than dangerous," she said. "And I caught him." He looked up then. His face was very close to hers, close enough that she could see the exhaustion in it, the same exhaustion she felt in herself, and underneath it, something that was not exhaustion at all. Something alert and present and carefully not named. "You could have been hurt," he said. His voice was quieter than usual. "I could have," Clara said. "I wasn't." He held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary. Then he tied off the bandage, clean and tight, and moved back, and the moment closed like water closing over a stone. But it had been there. They both knew it had been there. That night, after supper, Ethan poured 2 cups of coffee and brought them to the table and sat down. He didn't open the ledger. He didn't reach for the papers. He just sat with his coffee and looked at the surface of the table, and after a while said, without looking up, "Her name was Anne." Clara went still. "She and my son James were here for 2 years before the fever came through. James was 4. He turned the cup slowly in his hands. "I was out moving cattle when it started. By the time I got back, it had been 2 days. By the end of the week—" He stopped. "The doctor said it wasn't anything I could have changed. Being there wouldn't have changed it." "But you didn't believe him," Clara said quietly. "I didn't believe him," Ethan said. He picked up his coffee and drank it and set the cup down. "I'm telling you this," he said, "because you've been careful with me. Since you found that photograph. I know you found it." He looked at her. "And I want you to know I've noticed what it costs a person to be that careful." Clara looked at him. "It doesn't cost me," she said. "It's just decent." "It's more than decent," he said. "Most people can't sit with someone else's grief without trying to fix it. You just let it be there. And that's—" He stopped. "That's not nothing." The house was very quiet. "I'm sorry about Anne," Clara said. "And James." He nodded once, the kind of nod that takes something in and holds it rather than deflecting it. They sat with their coffee in the quiet kitchen, and the night pressed against the windows, and neither of them tried to make it into something more than it was. Which was already, in its way, more than she'd expected to find on any mountain. The next morning, Ethan rode out for the land surveyor Aldrich before the sun was fully up. Clara ran the ranch. She checked the cattle, worked the horses, repaired a section of fence that the previous day's urgency had left undone, and all the while kept half her attention on the road below, watching for the shape of a horse and rider that didn't belong. Briggs came back at noon. Not alone this time. He had 2 men with him that she didn't recognize. They rode up to the gate and stopped, and Briggs looked at the empty yard and then at Clara, who had come out of the barn and was standing in the middle of the yard with her arms at her sides and her face exactly neutral. "Callahan here?" Briggs asked. "He's on the ranch," Clara said, which was technically true. The ranch covered a significant amount of land. "I need to speak with him." "He's not available right now. I can take a message." Briggs shifted in his saddle. He looked at the 2 men with him, and something passed between them, and then he looked back at Clara with the flat, measuring look of a man deciding how much of his actual intention to reveal. "Mr. Grayson would like to make Callahan an offer," Briggs said. "A fair price for the South water rights. Formal paperwork, county registered, clean and legal." He paused. "He's being generous." "I'll let Mr. Callahan know," Clara said. "He'd want to hear it directly." "I'm sure he would. I'll tell him you came by." Another pause. Briggs was working out whether to push further. She could see him doing it, the slight calculation behind his eyes. He glanced at the house, at the barn, at Clara. "You're still here," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I work here," Clara said. "Mr. Grayson's concerned about your presence on this property," Briggs said, "given the outstanding legal matters in town." "Mr. Grayson's concerns about my presence are his own business," Clara said. "Not mine, and not Mr. Callahan's." Briggs smiled the tooth smile again. "Mrs. Whitfield, I'd be careful if I were you. Woman in your position, out here alone." "I'm not alone," Clara said. Her voice was flat and clear as creek water. "I'm on private property with lawful employment, and you're standing at a gate you haven't been invited through." She held his eyes. "Safe ride back, Briggs." Something moved across his face. Something that wasn't the tooth smile anymore. He turned his horse. The 2 men turned theirs. They rode down the mountain without another word, and Clara stood in the yard and watched them go, and held herself perfectly together until they were out of sight. Then she walked to the fence post nearest to her and held onto it with both hands for about 30 seconds. She was not afraid. She told herself that, and it was partly true. What she was aware. Sharply, specifically aware of how isolated this ranch was, and how much Grayson was willing to move, and how the situation had escalated past legal challenge into something more direct. Something that involved 3 men riding up a mountain in the middle of a weekday. She went inside and found Ethan's rifle and set it on the kitchen table where she could see the door. Then she went back to work. Ethan came back in the late afternoon with Aldrich, a small, weathered man of about 65 with the unhurried manner of someone who has spent a lifetime being precise. He dismounted slowly and looked at the land with a surveyor's particular quality of attention, like he was reading it. Ethan was beside Clara before he'd even unsaddled his horse, close enough to speak quietly. "You all right?" "Briggs came back," she said. 3 men, noon." His face tightened. "What did they want?" "To make you an offer on the South water rights, and to remind me that I'm vulnerable." Something moved through his expression. Controlled, but not entirely. She'd seen him angry once, over the deliberately cut fence, and it had been a very quiet kind of anger. The kind that goes down rather than up, that compresses rather than explodes. He had that look now. "Did they threaten you directly?" he asked. "Briggs implied," she said. "Nothing actionable. But enough." "Enough," she confirmed. He looked at her. "Are you frightened?" Clara considered the question honestly. "I'm not frightened of them," she said. "I'm frightened of how much power he has to keep moving pieces around the board before we can nail anything down." She paused. "That's a different thing." "It is," Ethan said. "And it's the right thing to be frightened of." He glanced at the kitchen window where she'd left the rifle visible through the glass. He said nothing about it, but something in his posture changed. A fractional easing, the way a person relaxes when they find out someone they were worried about had handled something exactly right. They brought Aldrich to the south pasture before the light failed. Clara walked him through her measurements, explained the discrepancy, showed him the original deed description, and then the survey stake exactly where she'd found it. Aldrich asked questions in his unhurried way, took his own measurements with his instruments, said nothing for a long time. Then he looked up. "Someone moved this marker," he said. "Not by accident. There's been digging here. You can see where the ground was disturbed and resettled." He looked at his measurements. Moved approximately 14 feet southwest, enough to put the creek outside the easement boundary if you're working from the county survey. Clara felt the cold confirmation of it settle in her chest. "Can you certify that in writing?" Ethan asked. "I can," Aldrich said. "I'll need to make a formal notation and file a correction with the county. That'll take a few days." "Can you do it before you go back to town?" Clara asked. Aldrich looked at her. "You want a sworn statement before I leave this mountain." "I want it before Grayson has a chance to talk to you," she said directly. The old man was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've been a land surveyor in this county for 31 years, Mrs. Whitfield. Walter Grayson's tried to buy my opinion twice. Both times I declined." A pause. "I'll write the statement tonight." They walked back in the gathering dusk, and Clara felt the shape of things shifting. Not in their favor completely, not yet, but tilting. The pieces were there. The documentation, the survey statement, her 17 pages, the original deed. If they could get it in front of the right person before Grayson could bury it. She was thinking through this when Ethan fell into step beside her and said very quietly, "Hoffman sent word." She looked at him. "When?" "Letter arrived while we were with Aldrich. My neighbor brought it up from the post office." He reached into his vest pocket and handed her a folded piece of paper. She read it in the last of the evening light, moving her lips slightly the way she did when she was reading something that needed to be absorbed precisely. Hoffman had received Ethan's letter. He was in the next county visiting his sister. He had not been called away on personal business. He had been told, by the county commissioner's office, that his position was under review for unspecified irregularities, and that he should take a period of administrative leave pending investigation. He believed this was false. He was returning to the county seat on Wednesday. He had been keeping his own records of irregularities in the land filing office for the past 8 months, ever since he'd noticed the first suspicious amendment to a survey document. He had those records with him. Clara lowered the ladder. "He's been building a case," she said. "He's been building a case," Ethan said, "for 8 months." She looked at the letter again. "Grayson moved him out of the way because he knew Hoffman was watching. He needed him gone before you arrived, so you'd see the falsified survey without a witness who knew it was false. And instead," Ethan said, "Hoffman is coming back with 8 months of documentation." Clara looked up. The first stars were appearing above the tree line, the specific thick star sky of the high mountains that she had not known before this summer, and now could not imagine not knowing. "We need to get to the county seat," she said, "before Wednesday, before Grayson finds out Hoffman is coming back and does something to stop him." "Tuesday morning," Ethan said. "Both of us. Aldrich too, with his statement." "The ranch. I'll ask Peterson from the next property over. He owes me considerably more than one favor." He paused. "Clara." She looked at him. He used her given name so rarely that when he did, it had a particular weight to it. "This is going to move fast from here," he said. "Grayson's going to know we're coming. He always knows. And when he does, he won't just send Briggs." "I know," she said. "You don't have to be in that courthouse." She looked at him steadily. "Yes," she said. "I do." She held his gaze. "That's my name on those fraud allegations. My husband's easement they falsified. My life he dismantled." She folded Hoffman's letter carefully and put it in her pocket. "I will be in that courthouse." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. The mountain air moved between them, cold and clean, and somewhere below, a long way below, Walter Grayson was sitting in his comfortable house, not yet knowing that the woman he had tried to erase from the county records had spent the last 2 weeks on a mountain building the case that would undo him. "All right," Ethan said. He said it the way he said things he meant completely, without ceremony, without decoration, just the words, carrying their full weight. They went inside to plan. Aldrich wrote his statement at the kitchen table that night. Formal, precise, the language of a man who had spent 31 years translating the physical world into legal documentation. Clara made a copy in her careful hand. Ethan wrote a letter to the county judge. Clara drafted a formal statement of her own. Her account of the events in Millhaven, the sequence of Grayson's actions, the fraud allegations and their genesis, everything documented with dates and specifics and the kind of clear logical structure that she had learned keeping accounts and that she now understood was the most powerful thing she possessed. Not rescue, not charity, not someone stepping in to fix what was broken. Evidence. Her evidence. Built from her own knowledge, her own memory, her own 2 weeks of work on a mountain in the dark. They worked until midnight. Then Aldrich went to the spare room Clara had set up for him, and Ethan sat for another few minutes at the table, and Clara gathered the papers into the order they would need to be presented. "Get some sleep," Ethan said. "In a minute," she said. He watched her working. The careful hands, the precise movements, the absolute focus. He watched her the way he'd been watching her for weeks. The way you watch something you've come to depend on without quite deciding to. The way you watch something you're not ready to name, but can't look away from either. "Clara," he said. She looked up. "Whatever happens Tuesday." He stopped, started again. "You came to this mountain asking for a place beside a fire. I want you to know." He paused. "You built something up here, something real. That belongs to you, whatever the courthouse says." She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her face that had been held tight and careful for months, longer, maybe, much longer, shifted very slightly. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for not making me ask twice." He nodded once, in that way he had. And then he got up and went to bed, and she listened to his footsteps down the hall, and she sat for another moment at the kitchen table, with the papers and the lantern, and the silence of the mountain around her. Tuesday was coming. Walter Grayson didn't know it yet, but Clara Whitfield was ready. Show more. They left the mountain before first light on Tuesday. Aldrich rode ahead at his own pace, slow and deliberate, the way he did everything, and Clara and Ethan came behind him with the full weight of every document they had built between them over the past 2 weeks. Clara had the papers in a satchel strapped across her body. She had not put them in the saddlebag. She had not let them out of her immediate reach since midnight, and she was not going to. The ride down was cold and quiet. The mountain released them slowly, the way it did everything, without ceremony, without sentiment. Below, the valley was still dark. Millhaven was somewhere in that dark, and the county seat was 2 hours past it, and Walter Grayson was somewhere between here and there, waking up and beginning his Tuesday without yet knowing what was moving toward him. Clara thought about that, about the particular advantage of being underestimated, about how a man like Grayson built his whole strategy on the assumption that the people he moved against would stay where he put them. She had not stayed where he put her. She rode the chestnut mare and kept her back straight and her eyes forward and said nothing for the first hour because there was nothing that needed saying. Ethan rode beside her, not ahead, not behind, beside. She noticed it. They passed the road that turned toward Millhaven just before 7 in the morning. Clara looked down it for exactly 1 second. The town was waking up. She could see the first smoke from chimneys, the shape of early movement. People who had watched her go. People who had looked away. She looked forward again. "You all right?" Ethan said. "Yes," she said, and meant it. They reached the county seat by 9 o'clock. It was a larger town than Millhaven, a proper main street, a courthouse with actual columns, a land registry office with its own building. The kind of town that felt, on the surface, like a place where rules applied and were applied fairly. Clara had stopped believing in surfaces. Ethan tied the horses at the post outside the registry office. Aldrich was already there, having taken a slightly shorter route. He knew the county roads the way he knew survey lines, precisely and without hesitation. He was sitting on the front steps with his hat on his knee, and he looked up when they arrived. "Hoffman's inside," Aldrich said. "Been there since 8. Clara felt something tighten in her chest. "Is he alone? Had a man with him when he arrived. Young fella, looked like a clerk. They're in the back office. Aldrich paused. Also saw two of Grayson's hands ride through the main street about 20 minutes ago. Didn't stop. Kept moving. Ethan and Clara exchanged a look. He knows we're here, Ethan said. Or he will shortly, Clara said. Let's not waste the time we have. They went inside. The land registry office smelled of and lamp oil and the particular dry smell of records that had accumulated for years. A young man behind the front counter looked up with the expression of a person who was not expecting visitors and was not entirely pleased about them. We're here to see Registrar Hoffman, Ethan said. Mr. Hoffman is... Please tell him Ethan Callahan is here, Ethan said. He's expecting me. The young man went to the back. There was a brief murmur of voices, and then a door opened, and a man came out that Clara recognized from description. Mid-50s, a neat gray beard, eyes that had the look of someone who had been under pressure for a sustained period and was holding up through sheer professional discipline. Hoffman looked at Ethan, then at Clara, then at the satchel across her body. Come in, he said. Close the door behind you. The back office was cramped with files. Hoffman had a stack of papers on his desk that Clara immediately recognized as county records. The real ones, she realized, or at least what remained of them. He sat down and looked at them both and said, without preamble, How much do you have? Enough, Clara said. She opened the satchel and began laying documents on the desk in the order she'd organized them the night before. Survey discrepancy, 17 pages. Aldrich's sworn statement. The original deed with the creek easement. Her account of the Millhaven events. Thomas's business records. The bank letter. The sequence of Grayson's actions, dated and sourced. Hoffman looked at each piece as she placed it. He picked up Aldrich's statement and read it carefully. He set it down and picked up Clara's 17 pages and read the first 3. He put them down and looked up. Mrs. Whitfield, he said. Did you measure that survey stake in the dark, alone? I had a lantern, she said. He stared at her for a moment. Then he turned to his own stack of papers. I have 8 months of documentation from this office. 11 instances of survey amendments filed without proper authorization. 7 property records with altered boundary descriptions. 3 easement challenges that were filed and then withdrawn under circumstances that didn't make sense to me at the time. He paused. I flagged them internally. I wrote internal memos. I was told by the commissioner's office that I was misreading standard amendment procedures. And then you were sent on administrative leave, Clara said. And then I was sent on administrative leave, Hoffman confirmed, with the flat evenness of a man who has had time to be angry and has reached the other side of it. The timing, 1 week after Mr. Callahan's inquiry to this office, was not, I believe, a coincidence. It wasn't, Ethan said. Hoffman looked at the combined pile of documentation on his desk. He was quiet for a long moment, and Clara watched him do what she recognized as something she did herself. Organize. Not panic. Not react. Just take the full picture in and arrange it into a sequence that could be acted upon. I need to file a formal correction to the survey record before noon, Hoffman said, with Aldrich's statement attached. Once it's filed, it becomes part of the official county record and cannot be amended without a court order. He looked at Ethan. Your water rights will be stabilized. Grayson can challenge them, but he'd have to do it through a formal legal proceeding with this documentation on record. He can't simply amend his way around it anymore. What about the fraud allegations against Mrs. Whitfield? Ethan said. Hoffman looked at Clara. Those came from the bank, not from this office. But if Mrs. Whitfield's account of Grayson's actions in Millhaven is documented and filed, it creates a formal record that directly contradicts the narrative he established. He paused. The county judge would need to review it. Then we need the judge today, Clara said. Hoffman was quiet for a second. Judge Alderman is a careful man. He doesn't move quickly. Then we make the case quickly, Clara said. We put everything in front of him today, before Grayson can get anyone in that office to bury it. We have the survey evidence, your 8 months of records, my documentation. We have Aldrich's sworn statement. She looked at Hoffman steadily. What we need is someone to present it who the judge will listen to. Hoffman looked at her for a long moment. You've thought this through very carefully, Mrs. Whitfield. I had 17 pages to write, and a long night to write them in, Clara said. Yes. He picked up Aldrich's statement again. Then he stood up. All right, he said. Let's file the correction first. Then I'll send word to Judge Alderman. What happened next moved fast. The way things move fast when several processes that have been building separately suddenly converge. Hoffman filed the survey correction at 11:15, with Aldrich's statement attached and 3 witnesses present: Ethan, Clara, and the young clerk who turned out to be Hoffman's personal assistant and not, as it happened, anyone connected to Grayson's office. The correction was stamped and recorded at 11:22. At 11:40, a man Clara didn't know came into the registry office and spoke quietly to Hoffman and left. Hoffman came to where Clara and Ethan were sitting and said, Grayson's attorney is at the commissioner's office. He's filed an objection to my reinstatement. Clara set down the coffee she'd been holding. On what grounds? The irregularities they cited when they sent me on leave, Hoffman said. They're going to try to invalidate any action I've taken this morning on the basis that I was not in an authorized capacity. Can they do that? Ethan said. They can try, Hoffman said. But the filing was witnessed and stamped. The record exists. He paused. The question is whether the commissioner's office moves to expunge it before we get in front of the judge. Clara stood up. Then we need to be in front of the judge before the commissioner's office does anything. She looked at Ethan. He was already picking up his hat. The county courthouse was 3 blocks from the registry office. They walked fast. Aldrich came with them, carrying his instruments case and his statement with the calm of a man who had walked into uncomfortable legal situations before and found them survivable. Hoffman was on their left, moving at a pace Clara suspected he didn't usually manage. The courthouse had that particular weight of official buildings. Thick walls, high ceilings, the sound of footsteps carrying further than they should. A clerk at the front desk looked up at 4 people arriving with evident purpose and an armload of documentation and had the good sense not to ask them to slow down. We need to see Judge Alderman, Hoffman said. Immediately. Land rights emergency. Active filing under contestation. The clerk went to find the judge. They waited in the hallway. Clara stood with the satchel across her body and her hands folded in front of her and her face composed. Ethan stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the steadiness of him, that particular quality he had of being very still in situations that called for stillness, which she had come to understand was not passivity, but control. The deep, practiced control of someone who had learned, at great cost, how to be present without losing himself. She thought, we are not 2 people who ran toward each other. We are 2 people who walked toward the same difficult thing and found each other doing it. Aldrich sat down on the hallway bench. He had done everything his part of the plan required. He looked like a man prepared to wait as long as necessary. The clerk came back. Judge Alderman will see you in chambers. Now. They followed the clerk. The corridor turned twice, and then a door opened into a room where a large, gray-bearded man in his 60s sat behind a wide desk covered in the organized clutter of active judicial work. He looked up when they came in with the expression of a man who has seen many things, arrive at his desk unexpectedly, and has developed an equanimity about it. Mr. Hoffman, he said, I was told this was urgent. It is, Your Honor, Hoffman said. I apologize for the manner of the approach. The timing did not allow for a scheduled appointment. Sit down, all of you, Judge Alderman said. He looked at Clara. And you are? Clara Whitfield, Your Honor, she said. Wife of the late Thomas Whitfield of Millhaven. Something shifted in his expression at the name. Whitfield. There was a fraud matter. Alleged fraud, Clara said. Your Honor, with your permission, I'd like to show you why those allegations were false, who generated them, and why, and what else that same individual has been doing to land filings in this county for at least the past 8 months. Judge Alderman looked at her for a moment. He looked at Hoffman. He looked at the stack of papers Clara was already beginning to organize on the edge of his desk. Begin, he said. She began. She had organized it the night before in the kitchen, After Aldrich had gone to bed and Ethan had said goodnight, alone at the table with the lantern. She had put it in order the way she put everything in order, not by what felt most important, but by what led most clearly to the next thing. Build the foundation first, then the structure, then the weight. She started with Thomas's original filing, the legitimate account records, the creek easement, properly registered. She explained, clearly without drama, what the store had been and how it had operated and what the financial records showed. Then she laid out the bank letter, the suspension of accounts, the attorney referral. Then she said Walter Grayson's name for the first time. She said it the way you say something you have been holding carefully for a long time, not with heat, but with precision. She walked the judge through each of Grayson's visits, each escalation after her refusals. The pattern that emerged when you looked at the timeline, the bank action following the third visit, the landlord following the bank, the newspaper following the landlord, the systematic dismantling of every structure that kept her in Millhaven. Then Hoffman laid out his 8 months of records. The judge read in silence. He read carefully and completely, with the slow thoroughness of a man who understood that what he was looking at mattered and could not be half done. He asked questions, sharp, specific, the questions of someone who was following the logic and checking each link. Hoffman answered from his records. Clara answered from hers. Aldrich answered about the survey stake with the quiet authority of 31 years. Ethan said very little. He didn't need to. He sat in the corner of the chamber, and when the judge addressed him directly, he answered directly, and when he wasn't addressed, he was simply present, solid and still and certain, the way the mountain itself was certain, and Clara found, in a way she hadn't expected, that she was drawing on that certainty the way you draw warmth from something that radiates it without meaning to. They had been in chambers for an hour when the first interruption came, a knock at the door. The clerk entered, visibly uncomfortable. Your Honor, there is a representative of Mr. Walter Grayson requesting an urgent meeting with you regarding an active filing matter. Judge Alderman looked up from the papers. Tell him I'm engaged. He was quite insistent, Your Honor. I don't doubt it, the judge said. Tell him I'm engaged. The clerk withdrew. Clara felt Ethan shift very slightly in his seat. She didn't look at him, but she felt it. Hoffman continued presenting his records. 15 minutes later, the knock came again. Your Honor, the representative is still engaged, the judge said, without looking up. The third interruption, 20 minutes after that, was not a knock. It was a door that opened before the clerk could knock, and a man walked in who was not the clerk. A man in a good suit and a good hat, with the bearing of someone accustomed to walking through doors that technically require permission. Your Honor, the man said, I apologize for the intrusion. I am David Croft, representing Walter Grayson of Millhaven. I have here a formal motion to stay any proceedings involving Registrar Hoffman on the grounds of his current administrative suspension. Mr. Croft, Judge Alderman said. His voice had a quality Clara hadn't heard from him yet. Not loud, but absolute. The kind of tone that ends in a period regardless of what comes after it. You have walked into my private chambers without invitation. I am in the middle of a review of active filings that touch directly on your client's interests, which means your presence in this room right now constitutes an ex parte contact that I will be noting in my records. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Croft stopped. He had the good sense to understand that something had gone wrong with the entry. Your Honor, You will leave these chambers, the judge said. You will wait in the public hallway. If I determine a hearing is warranted, you and your client will be notified through proper channels in proper time. If you open this door again without invitation, I will hold you in contempt. Am I clear? A pause that lasted just long enough to be humiliating. Yes, Your Honor. Croft left. The door closed. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Judge Alderman looked at Clara and said, Continue, Mrs. Whitfield. She continued. It was another 40 minutes before he set down the last paper and leaned back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment, looking at the ceiling in the way of a man who is putting things into their final order. Mrs. Whitfield, he said, the fraud allegations against you, The bank's position on the account dispute. None of that originated from a legitimate audit. No, Your Honor, Clara said. The documentation you've presented is consistent with that conclusion. The timing of the bank action, the referral to an attorney with a known professional relationship to Grayson, the subsequent displacement actions. It's a pattern. He paused. It's a very clear pattern. He looked at Hoffman. The survey amendments you've documented, the altered boundary records, were any of these filed through your office directly or through the Commissioner's office? Through the Commissioner's office, Your Honor, using override authority that is technically available but is not, to my knowledge, supposed to be exercised for routine land boundary amendments. Who authorized the overrides? Deputy Commissioner Harlan, Hoffman said. In each case. The judge wrote something down. Clara watched him write it and felt the specific cold understanding of how deep this went. Not just Grayson acting alone. The deputy commissioner, the bank, the attorney. A whole structure of people who had decided, at various points, that cooperating with Walter Grayson was safer or more profitable than not. Your Honor, Clara said. Deputy Commissioner Harlan, does he have the authority to invalidate a filed easement without a court order? The judge looked at her. No, he said. He does not. Then the easement on Thomas Whitfield's Creek property is still legally valid. A pause. If the filing was properly executed at the time of registration, and from what I've seen here, it was, then yes, it remains valid. He paused. Which means any subsequent amendments to the survey that placed the creek outside the easement boundary were made in error, or made deliberately in contravention of the original filing. Made deliberately, Clara said. Not a question. The judge looked at her for a long moment. Mrs. Whitfield, he said, how long did it take you to build this case? 17 days, Clara said. Approximately. He was quiet. Then, your husband taught you to keep records? My father taught me, she said. My husband taught me why it mattered. The judge picked up Aldrich's statement one more time. He read it through. Not the full thing, just the key paragraph, the specific measurements, the conclusion. Then he set it down, and he looked at all four of them, and he said, I am going to order a full review of the land filings referenced in Mr. Hoffman's records. I am going to restore Mr. Hoffman to full duty pending that review. I am going to issue a preliminary ruling that the Whitfield Creek easement remains valid and binding, and that the amended survey markers are to be treated as contested pending verification by an independent surveyor, which, given that Mr. Aldrich has already done that work and filed a sworn statement, should be a brief process. He paused. I am also going to send a formal inquiry to Deputy Commissioner Harlan's office and to the Millhaven Territorial Bank. Clara's hands, folded in her lap, were not shaking. She made sure of that. As for the fraud allegations against you, he continued, I cannot formally dismiss them from this chamber. That would require a separate proceeding. But I can tell you that based on what I've seen today, I have serious doubts about their foundation, and I will be making that position known to the appropriate parties. He looked at her directly. In plain terms, Mrs. Whitfield, I don't believe you defrauded anyone. The words landed quietly. Clara took them in quietly. Thank you, Your Honor, she said. Her voice was steady. Don't thank me, he said. You built the case. I just read it. They came out of the courthouse into the afternoon sun and stood on the steps, and Clara breathed for a moment. A real breath. The kind that fills the full depth of your lungs, that you don't realize you haven't been taking until you take one. Aldrich put his hat back on. Well, he said, with the understatement of someone who had been in difficult situations before, that went better than I expected. Hoffman shook Ethan's hand, then Clara's. His grip was firm, and there was something in his eyes. The release of a man who has been carrying something heavy alone for 8 months and has finally set it down somewhere it can be dealt with. I'll begin the full review tomorrow morning, he said. I'll be in touch about the proceedings. He went back inside. Aldrich nodded to them both and went to find his horse. And then it was just the two of them on the courthouse steps, and the town moving around them, and Walter Grayson's attorney standing across the street with the look of a man who has just watched something go in a direction he was not paid to allow. Clara looked at Croft across the street. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned away, which was its own kind of statement. "He'll go straight to Grayson," Ethan said quietly. "I know," Clara said. "Let him." Ethan was looking at her with that particular quality of attention she'd learned to recognize. Not the assessment look, not the calculation. Something else. Something that had been building in small increments over 17 days of early mornings and hard work and kitchen tables and things said in the dark. "What do you want to do now?" he said. Clara thought about it. About Millhaven, down the road. About the people who had watched her go. About the sheriff with his folded hands, and the newspaper editor with his advertiser, and the boarding house wife who had called her a dear friend. "I want to go back to the ranch," she said. "I want to check on the gray horse. I want to eat supper and know that the papers are filed and the record is correct, and that Walter Grayson is going to have to fight this in a courtroom instead of in a back office with a deputy commissioner." She paused. "And I want to sleep without making a plan." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then, "The gray horse is probably fine." "I know," she said. "I want to check anyway." He looked at her. Something moved through his face that was warmer than his usual expression, more present, less guarded. The face of a man who has spent 3 years behind walls he built himself and is standing, for the first time, at an open window. "Come on then," he said. They went to get the horses, but the day was not finished. They were at the livery stable when a boy came running, one of those town boys who always seem to exist near livery stables, quick and alert to the currency of information. He stopped in front of Ethan and said, breathing hard, "Mr. Callahan, man at the hotel told me to find you. Says it's important. Says his name is Reeves, and he rode in from Millhaven this morning." Ethan and Clara looked at each other. "Where is he?" Ethan said. "Hotel dining room," the boy said. Ethan gave him a coin, and they went to the hotel. The man named Reeves was in his 60s, heavy-set, with the hands of someone who had worked outdoors for a long time, and the face of someone who was not entirely comfortable with what he was about to say. He stood when they came in and took his hat in both hands. "Mr. Callahan," he said. Then he looked at Clara. "Mrs. Whitfield." "Mr. Reeves," she said. She didn't know him, but something in his manner, the hat, the standing, the way he was holding himself, told her he had come to say something difficult. "Sit down, Mr. Reeves," Ethan said. They sat. Reeves put his hat on the table and looked at it for a moment. "I had the store on Millhaven's East End," he said. "Hardware. I've been there 12 years. He paused. "I watched what Grayson did to you, Mrs. Whitfield. Watched it happen. Didn't say anything. Told myself it wasn't my business." He stopped. Then, "My wife told me I was wrong. She's been telling me for 2 months. I reckon she's right." Clara looked at him, said nothing. "I'm not the only one," Reeves said. "There are 6 families in Millhaven that Grayson has pushed around in the last 5 years. Land disputes, business pressures. His bank holds notes on half the property in town, and he's called in favors on every one of them when it served him." He looked up. "When word got around that you'd gone to the county seat, that you had documentation, 3 of those families sent me to find out if there was something they could do." Clara sat very still. "They want to come forward," Reeves said. "They want to add their accounts to whatever case is being built. But they're frightened. Grayson holds their notes. He could call them due at any time." He paused. They needed to know if it was worth the risk. Clara thought about the judge, and the filing, and the words, "I don't believe you defrauded anyone." She thought about Hoffman and his 8 months of records. She thought about the pattern, the word the judge had used. Not just Grayson acting against her, but Grayson acting against everyone who didn't cooperate, systematically, over years, with a structure of people who helped him do it. And she thought about the difference between a case and a movement. A case could be dismissed, buried, managed by men with enough resources to outlast a single person's documentation. A movement was harder to bury. She looked at Ethan. He looked back at her. He didn't tell her what to think. He never did. He just waited for her to think it. She turned back to Reeves. "Tell them it's worth the risk," she said. Tell them the survey evidence is already on record, and the judge is reviewing 8 months of filing irregularities. Tell them we have documentation of the pattern and a judge who's seen it and called it what it is." She paused. "Tell them they won't be standing alone." Reeves looked at her for a long moment. He picked up his hat and turned it once in his hands. "My wife said to tell you," he said, "that she's sorry for what the boarding house did, for not standing up sooner." He met her eyes. "She wanted you to hear that." Clara thought about the woman who had told her apologetically that there had been concerns raised about reputation and association. She thought about how much damage could be done by people who weren't malicious, just afraid. Just choosing the easier path, one small decision at a time. "Tell her I understand," Clara said, "and that I'd rather have her standing now than spend time on what came before." Reeves nodded. He put on his hat. He stood and shook Ethan's hand and nodded to Clara with the gravity of someone who has done something he should have done months ago and knows it. Then he left. And the dining room was quiet, and Ethan looked at Clara and said, very quietly, 6 families. "At least 6, she said. "Grayson has been running the same pattern for 5 years. There will be more." "This stops being a land dispute," he said. "It stopped being a land dispute when he went after your water rights to isolate me," Clara said. "We just needed enough pieces to show the shape of the whole thing." She looked at the door Reeves had gone through. "Now we have them." They sat for a moment in the quiet of the hotel dining room, and the afternoon light came through the window at a low angle the way it did in late August. And outside the town went about its Tuesday business. And somewhere in that town, Walter Grayson's attorney was delivering news that would change the shape of everything Grayson had built. "He's going to fight it," Ethan said. "I know," Clara said. "He's going to fight it hard, and he's going to use every resource he has, and it's going to be unpleasant for a period of time." She folded her hands on the table. "But he's going to fight it in the open now, in a courtroom, with a judge who's seen the pattern, with 6 families willing to testify, with Hoffman's 8 months of records, with a corrected survey on file." She paused. "He's never had to fight in the open before. He doesn't know how." Ethan was quiet for the moment. "You do," he said. She looked at him. "Know how to fight in the open," he said. "You've been doing it since you walked into that county office with your ledgers." Clara looked down at her hands on the table, at the burn on her left forearm, healing but still marked, at the ink stain on her right index finger from 17 pages of documentation written by lantern light before dawn. She thought about Thomas and what he would have made of all this. He would have been frightened, she thought. He was a man of warmth and humor and deep decency, but he was not built for conflict the way she apparently was. He would have been frightened, and he would have believed in her anyway, which was exactly what she had loved about him. She thought about a woman who had walked out of a town before sunrise, carrying everything she had in a broken suitcase, who had asked a stranger for a place beside his fire, who had built something on a mountain through sheer determination to keep going. "We should get back," she said. "The gray horse is not going to check himself." Ethan almost smiled. The almost smile she'd learned to read over 17 days and had come to look for in the way you look for something that means the world is still working as it should. "The gray horse," he said, "is going to be fine." "I know," she said. "I want to see it anyway." They rode back to the mountain in the late afternoon, and the valley spread below them as they climbed, and the county seat was behind them with its courthouse and its fresh filings and its judge who had looked at the full picture and said, "I don't believe you defrauded anyone." And somewhere in the valley, in the town she'd left before sunrise on a Thursday in June, 6 families were telling each other that it was worth the risk. And Clara Whitfield rode up the mountain with her back straight and her eyes on what was ahead, and the satchel across her body was lighter now, because most of what it had carried was sitting on a judge's desk in a record that could not be amended without a court order. But the fight was not over. She knew that. She had always known that. The difference was that now, for the first time, it was a fair one. The formal hearing was set for the 2nd week of September. Judge Alderman moved faster than Hoffman had predicted, not because he was an impulsive man, but because what he had seen in his chambers on that Tuesday afternoon had convinced him that delay served no one except the person who had built the longest on delay. The notice went out on Wednesday. By Thursday, Walter Grayson's attorney had filed 3 separate motions to postpone. The judge denied all 3. Clara found out about the motions from Hoffman, who sent word up the mountain with a rider on Friday morning. She read the letter at the kitchen table while Ethan drank his coffee and waited, and when she was done, she folded it and set it down. "He's trying to buy time," she said. "He always buys time," Ethan said. "It's his first move. Grind the other side down until they run out of money or will." "He doesn't know I've been running on almost nothing for months already," Clara said. "I'm well past the point where grinding does anything." Ethan looked at her over his coffee. "What does the letter say about the 6 families?" "Reeves confirmed 4 of them have agreed to provide formal testimony. A 5th is still deciding. The 6th—" She paused. "Grayson called in the note on their property last week. They had to withdraw." The room went quiet. "He knows the families are coming forward," Ethan said. "He knows," Clara said. "And he's telling everyone else what happens if they do." She set the letter flat on the table with her palm pressed against it, the way she did when she was holding something that needed to be held steadily. She thought about the family whose note had been called, about the choice they'd faced, their land, their livelihood, against the risk of standing up, about how that was exactly the calculation Grayson had always relied on. Make the cost of opposition higher than the cost of silence. "We need those 4 families protected before the hearing," she said. "If he can get to their notes before we get to the courthouse." "I already sent word to the bank examiner in Helena," Ethan said. Clara looked up. "Tuesday evening, while you were writing letters," he said. "I wrote to a man I know in the territorial capital. Banker. Honest one, which is rare enough that I've kept track of him." He paused. "I told him what we had and asked him to flag any mass note-calling activity from Millhaven Territorial in the next 30 days. She looked at him for a moment. At this man who said very little and moved very precisely, who had spent 3 years alone on a mountain thinking through things that mattered, who had apparently, while she was writing 17 pages by lantern light, been writing his own letters. "You didn't tell me," she said. "You had enough to carry," he said, simply, without apology, because it wasn't an apology situation. She held his gaze for the moment. "Next time," she said, "tell me." "Next time," he said, "I will." She went back to the letter. Outside, the ranch was moving through its morning. The sounds she'd learned in weeks of early mornings. The particular rhythm of a working place that doesn't pause for human difficulties. She had come to love that about it. The way the work continued regardless. The way it asked only what it always asked. Show up, pay attention, do what needs doing. She intended to show up to that courthouse the same way. The week before the hearing was the most difficult week since she'd left Millhaven, not because of the legal situation. That was progressing as well as she could have hoped, given the circumstances. Hoffman had completed his review and the filing irregularities now numbered 16 confirmed cases, all traceable through the Commissioner's office to authorizations that should not have been made. Deputy Commissioner Harlan had quietly requested a leave of absence. The bank examiner in Helena had responded to Ethan's letter with interest and had opened a preliminary inquiry of his own. The difficulty was different. It was the waiting. It was the particular strain of having done everything you could do and now needing time to pass, and time being the one thing that refused to be managed. Clara found herself waking before 3 in the morning and lying in the narrow room staring at the ceiling, running through the documentation in her head, checking for gaps, finding none, then finding possible ones, then checking again and finding none. It was the same quality of attention she'd given to ledgers in the store, that accounting mind that could not fully rest until every column balanced. One night, around the 4th day of that week, she got up at 3:30 and went to the kitchen table. She didn't light the lantern. She just sat in the dark with her hands flat on the table and made herself stop going through the documents in her head. She thought about Thomas instead, about what he would say if he could see her now. She could hear him clearly. She'd always been able to hear him clearly when she let herself, a quality of his voice that had stayed with her beyond his death in a way she was grateful for. He would have said, "Clara, You've already won this. You just have to wait for the world to catch up. He had always believed she was ahead of the world. She'd thought it was his particular kind of love coloring his judgment. She was starting to think maybe he'd just been accurate. She heard a floorboard in the hall. Then Ethan was at the kitchen doorway, fully dressed, or at least dressed enough, boots on, in the way of a man who doesn't sleep heavily. He looked at her sitting in the dark and didn't say anything for a moment. Then he went to the stove and put the coffee on. He sat across from her while it heated. The dark was the specific dark of the mountain before dawn, profound and quiet. Neither of them spoke. She didn't try to explain what she was doing up, and he didn't ask. When the coffee was ready, he poured 2 cups and set one in front of her and drank his own. After a long time, she said, "I keep checking the documents in my head." "I know," he said. "I can't find a gap." "There isn't one." "You don't know that for certain." "No," he said. "But I know you, and I know how you work, and if there was a gap, you'd have found it by now." She looked across the table at him. In the dark, he was mostly shape and voice. The voice she'd learned to listen for the way you listen for weather, for what it tells you underneath what it says. "I'm frightened," she said. And then, because it was true, and she was too tired to be proud about it. "Not of losing. I've already lost things I didn't think I could survive losing. I'm frightened of having done everything right, and it not being enough." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "There is no version of this," he said, "where you haven't already changed something permanent. The survey is corrected. The filings are on record. Hoffman has his documentation. The judge has seen the pattern." He paused. "Grayson can fight the hearing. He can throw everything he has at it. But he cannot unfile what's been filed, and he cannot make the judge unsee what he's seen. The world is already different than it was when you walked off that mountain 3 weeks ago." She listened to this, took it in the way she took in things that were true and needed to be held carefully. "You're very certain," she said. "I'm certain about the things I've had time to think through," he said. "I've had a lot of time." She almost smiled. 3 years of it. "Give or take," he said. They drank their coffee in the dark, and the mountain was quiet around them, and somewhere below the valley was sleeping, and the courthouse in the county seat was waiting, and Clara Whitfield sat across from a man who had given her a place beside his fire, and then given her, without quite meaning to, considerably more than that. She thought, "I did not come here to find this. I came here because there was nowhere else to go." And that's the thing about nowhere else. Sometimes what's there is exactly what you needed and didn't know how to look for. She did not say this out loud. It wasn't time for that yet. But she held it, carefully, the way she held things that mattered. The hearing day came on a Tuesday, the same day of the week as everything that had mattered in this story, which she would notice later and find somehow fitting. They rode down together, just the 2 of them. Peterson was running the ranch again. The gray horse was fully recovered and back to work, and the chestnut mare moved under Clara with the easy confidence of a horse that trusts its rider, which felt like something. Millhaven was between the mountain and the county seat, and they passed through it rather than around it. Clara had thought about this. She could have asked Ethan to take the longer route that bypassed the town. She chose not to. They rode down the main street of Millhaven at a steady pace, and people stopped to look. She recognized faces. The bank manager Pryor, standing outside the bank with the particular stillness of a man who has recently received official inquiries and is calculating their implications. The sheriff, at the door of his office, who looked at her and then looked at the road ahead of her with the particular direction change of a man avoiding someone's eyes. The newspaper editor, who was coming out of the print shop with a sheaf of papers and who stopped on the sidewalk and simply stood there. She rode past all of them with her back straight and her eyes forward. One person called her name. It was a woman. She turned and saw it was Mary Aldgate, who had run the millinery shop on the west end of the street. A quiet woman who had always been kind to Clara in the small transaction way of shopkeepers who didn't take sides. Mary was standing on the edge of the sidewalk, and she said, "Mrs. Whitfield." And when Clara pulled up slightly, she said, "Good luck today. A lot of people here are hoping." Clara looked at her. "Thank you, Mary," she said. She rode on. She didn't look back. But she felt it, the shift in the air of a town where something had begun to turn. Not all the way. Not cleanly. Small towns didn't turn cleanly. But the first degree of movement, the creak of a thing beginning to change direction. The courthouse was full. That was the first thing she noticed. She had not expected it to be full. She'd expected a formal legal proceeding with the relevant parties and their representatives and a handful of clerks. What she found was a room with every seat occupied and people standing along the back wall. Reeves was there, with his wife, who looked at Clara when she came in and nodded once with the contained intensity of a woman who has something to make right and intends to make it. 3 of the other families were there, ranchers and shopkeepers and their wives, people she recognized and people she didn't, people who had their own reasons to be in that room and had decided the reasons were sufficient. Hoffman was at the plaintiff's table with a stack of files that represented 8 months of his professional life. Aldrich was in the gallery with his instruments case on his knee. And at the defense table, Walter Grayson sat for the first time in Clara's presence since the morning she had left Mill Haven. He was impeccably dressed, controlled, projecting the absolute confidence of a man who has never lost publicly. His attorney Croft sat beside him, and 2 additional lawyers she didn't recognize sat beyond him. 3 lawyers. She had documentation and 4 families and a land registrar and a 31-year surveyor. She sat down at the plaintiff's table beside Hoffman and put the satchel on the table in front of her and folded her hands on top of it and looked straight ahead. Ethan sat directly behind her in the first row of the gallery. She felt him there without turning around. Judge Alderman came in, and the room stood and sat, and the hearing began. It lasted 4 hours. Grayson's attorney was skilled. She'd grant him that. Croft moved through his arguments with the fluid assurance of someone who had won a great many proceedings by controlling the framing of them. He challenged Hoffman's authority. He challenged the survey correction on procedural grounds. He argued that the fraud allegations against Clara were substantive and predated any impropriety by his client. He was smooth and precise and relentless, and entirely focused on making the individual pieces of their case seem smaller and more contingent than they were when taken together. Clara waited. She had learned, in 11 years of keeping accounts, that the person who speaks last in a numbers dispute almost always wins, because the person who speaks last has heard all the errors in the other position and can address them directly. She had structured their presentation the same way. When it was her turn, she stood up. She was aware of the room, the full room, the people in it. Grayson across the table, Ethan behind her, the judge at the bench. She was aware of all of it, and she set it aside, the way you set aside everything that isn't the column of numbers in front of you, because the column of numbers is what tells the truth. She started with the survey. She walked the judge, and the room, through the original filing, the Henderson easement, the Whitfield registration, and the sequence of amendments that followed over 8 years. She used Aldrich's measurements. She used Hoffman's documentation. She used dates and filing numbers and the specific language of each amendment. And she built the sequence with the patience of someone who knows that a clear picture, assembled piece by piece, is more persuasive than any argument about it. Then she laid out this pattern. Not just her case. All of it. Every family that had been pressured. Every note that had been leveraged. Every person who had been managed into cooperation or silence. She named names where she had documentation and stayed silent where she didn't, because precision was the whole point. She was 40 minutes into the presentation when Croft objected for the 7th time. Judge Alderman said, "Overruled. Continue, Mrs. Whitfield." She continued. When she was done, she sat down. Her hands were steady. Her voice had not broken once. She was aware, distantly, that this was remarkable, given what the past 3 months had been, and she filed that awareness away for later, for a moment when she had the space to be moved by it. The judge called a recess. In the corridor outside, Ethan came and stood beside her. He didn't say anything. She didn't need him to. They stood side by side with their backs against the wall and let the 15 minutes pass. When they went back in, Grayson was standing near the defense table talking to Croft in a low voice. She caught his eye once, inadvertently, just a second of direct contact across the room. He looked at her the way he had looked at her in his office that last day in Millhaven, with the controlled, certain expression of a man who does not expect to lose. She looked back at him with the expression of a woman who has stopped expecting anything and started building instead. Judge Alderman returned to the bench. He did not deliver a ruling immediately. He was not, as Hoffman had said, an impulsive man. He told both parties he would deliver his written ruling within 10 days. He noted, formally on the record, that the evidence of survey manipulation was significant and would require further investigation involving parties beyond this hearing. He noted that the pattern of financial pressure applied to multiple county residents through coordinated land and bank actions warranted a formal inquiry at the territorial level. He said, "The Whitfield Creek easement is hereby confirmed as valid and binding pending the outcome of that investigation. Any actions taken against the parties present today on the basis of the disputed survey amendments are stayed until further order of this court." The room was very quiet for a moment. Then Reeves's wife said something under her breath that might have been "thank God," and the room breathed, and the gavel came down, and it was done. Not all of it. The territorial inquiry would take months. Grayson's lawyers would fight everything they could fight. The full unraveling of what he had built. The deputy commissioner, the bank manager, the structure of compliances and pressures that had held half the valley for 5 years. That would be a long and ugly process. But the easement was confirmed. The survey was corrected. The record existed and could not be made to disappear. And Walter Grayson, who had never lost publicly, walked out of that courthouse in front of every person who had come to watch, and did not look like a man of considerable standing. He looked like a man whose foundation had just been examined. Clara stood on the courthouse steps in the September afternoon and felt the specific quality of an ending that is also a beginning. The hinge moment. The place where what comes before and what comes after meet. She had felt it once before, standing outside the county office in Millhaven the morning she signed her name for the last time. But that one had been an ending only, a door closing behind her. This one was different. Reeves came and shook her hand. His wife took Clara's hand in both of hers and said, "Thomas would have been proud." And Clara thought, yes. And also he would have been terrified. And also he would have brought coffee. And she loved him for all 3 things, and always would. Hoffman shook her hand and said the territorial inquiry team would be in contact within the month. Aldrich put his hat on and said he'd done good work in his 31 years, but he thought this survey correction might be his finest hour, and he said it with such complete lack of irony that she believed him entirely. The families dispersed. The gallery emptied. The courthouse returned to its daily business, because the daily business of a courthouse doesn't pause for the conclusions of particular cases. Clara stood on the steps until the crowd had thinned, and then she sat down on the top step and was still for a moment. Just still. Just present in the particular September light, with the sounds of the town around her, with the hearing behind her and the mountain ahead. Ethan sat down beside her on the step, close enough that their shoulders were nearly touching. He didn't look at her immediately. He looked at the street, at the town, at the ordinary afternoon moving through the ordinary business of an ordinary county seat that had been, for a few hours today, the center of something that mattered. After a while he said, "How are you?" "Tired," she said, "and glad." "Both at once," he said. "Usually both at once," she said. I was quiet for a moment. Then, "What do you want to do now?" She'd heard that question before. He'd asked it on these same courthouse steps in August, after the filing, and she'd said, "I want to go back to the ranch." She'd meant it then, and she meant it now. But there was more in the question this time, and she understood that, and she intended to answer it fully. "I want to go back to the mountain," she said. "I want to keep building what we've been building up there." She turned and looked at him. "I want to stop treating my place on that ranch like something I'm borrowing. I want to be there the way you're there, like it's mine too. Not because someone gave it to me." She held his gaze. "Because I earned it." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. The afternoon light was behind him, and his face was in full view. All of it, the weathered permanence of it, the careful quality that had been lifting by small degrees since the morning she'd arrived at his fire, until what was underneath it was visible. A man who had not stopped being alive, even in 3 years of trying to convince himself otherwise. "You earned it," he said. "First week." "You didn't tell me that," she said. "No," he said. "I wasn't ready to say it yet." She nodded. "And now?" He looked at her with that look she'd learned and would know for the rest of her life. The look that measured and found the measurement right. "Now," he said, "I'm ready to say a great deal more than that, when you're ready to hear it." Clara looked at him and felt something move through her that was not like anything she'd been feeling for the past 3 months. Not anger, not determination, not the clean, focused energy of a fight. Something quieter and deeper and more permanent than any of those. "I'm ready," she said. He nodded once. And then he reached over and covered her hand with his. Not a gentle gesture, not a romantic novel gesture, just the direct, complete gesture of a man who has made a decision and acts on it. And she turned her hand and held his, and that was that. They sat on the courthouse steps in the September afternoon. Two people who had come at things from very different directions and arrived, somehow, at the same place. And the town moved around them, and neither of them said anything for a while, because some things don't need filling with words. The ride back was the first easy one they'd had in weeks. Not because the road was different. It was the same mountain road, the same climb, the same sequence of switchbacks where the valley fell away below them. But something in the quality of it had changed. Something had been resolved, and resolution, she was learning, changed the texture of ordinary things. They talked on the way up. Not about the hearing, not about the inquiry, not about what came next legally or practically. They talked the way they had started to talk in the evenings over the past weeks. About smaller things, real things. About the gray horse and his recovery. About the cattle on the north pasture and whether the herd should be expanded before winter. About the supply shed and her ledger system and how she wanted to reorganize the east fence rotation. About Peterson's farm, adjacent to theirs, where the old man had been managing alone for too long and could use a neighborly hand some days. Theirs. She noticed the word form in her mind and let it stay. They were near the top of the ridge when Ethan said, "The room in the house, the one you're in." "What about it?" Clara said. "It was Anne's sewing room," he said. "Before James was born it was where she kept her things. I cleared it out the year after she died. Couldn't stand to leave it as it was." He paused. "Couldn't stand to use it either. So it sat." Clara listened. "I want you to have it properly," he said. "Not a room that's empty. Not a room you're borrowing. I want you to make it yours. Put your things in it the way a person puts their things in a room that belongs to them." He kept his eyes on the trail. "And I want to ask you something that I should ask before we get back, and the daily work takes over, and I find a reason to put it off, because I am genuinely capable of putting things off indefinitely when I'm nervous about them." She turned and looked at him. He was still looking at the trail, which she found endearing in a way that sat low and warm in her chest. "Ask it," she said. He looked at her then. "Will you stay?" he said. "Not as ranch help, not because you need a place, but because you want to be here. Because this—" He stopped. "Because I want you here, as long as you'll have this mountain." Clara thought about the woman who had walked off a road in June with $23 and a broken suitcase and nowhere to go. About asking for a place beside a fire. About building something from nothing but determination and the willingness to keep going. About a man who had moved aside without ceremony and said, "Sit down. You look like you've walked farther than most people would survive." "I'm already here," she said. "I never needed the asking, but I'm glad you did it." He nodded. Something in his whole bearing eased. The specific ease of a man who has been braced for something for a long time and has finally stood down. They rode the last half-mile in the comfortable quiet that was the best kind of quiet, the kind that doesn't need filling, the kind that means two people are in the same place by choice. The ranch came into view as they crested the ridge. The barn, the fences, the cattle on the north pasture, the main house with its smoke-stained chimney, and its small windows, and its narrow room that had been empty too long. Peterson's horse was in the yard, which meant Peterson had taken good care of things in their absence, as Ethan had known he would. Clara pulled up at the gate and looked at it. It was not a grand thing. It was a working ranch on a Montana mountain, hard-used and weather-worn and shaped by 8 years of a man's particular habits and 3 years of solitude, and the past few months of two people learning to work alongside each other without getting in each other's way. But it was real. It was genuinely, concretely real in the way that only things you've built with your hands and your attention and your willingness to keep going tend to be. She had fixed fences here. She had ridden this land in fire and storm. She had counted inventory and kept ledgers and worked cattle at dawn and sat up past midnight writing the documentation that had changed the legal shape of the valley below. She had learned this place the way you learn something you intend to keep. It was hers. It had been hers for a while, if she was honest. She rode through the gate. The gray horse was in the paddock, fully recovered, moving with the easy confidence of an animal that has come back from something and knows it. He lifted his head when she came through the gate, and she stopped the mare beside him and put her hand out, and he pushed his nose against it, warm and steady. Ethan came through the gate behind her and dismounted, and Peterson came out of the barn, and they exchanged the brief, practical conversation of men who have managed a ranch in each other's absence. And then Peterson rode out, and the ranch was theirs again. Its sounds, its rhythms, its particular quality of life that asked only for presence and attention. Clara dismounted. She led the mare to the barn and untacked her and rubbed her down and made sure she was watered, because that was what you did before anything else. Then she hung the tack in its correct place on the wall, not approximately, but correctly, in the place she had established for it weeks ago that made the most sense, given how the barn was organized and what the daily routine required. She came out of the barn into the evening light. Ethan was at the fence on the far side of the yard, checking the cattle on the north pasture the way he did every evening. That last visual sweep that was less about the cattle and more about the ritual of closing a day properly. She stood for a moment and looked at the whole of it. The mountain rising above, the ranch laid out below, the valley far down, where the hearing was now part of the county record and the inquiry was underway, and the world was, slowly, correcting itself. And here, on this ground, the life that had been built out of a single question asked in the dark. She thought of the fire she'd walked toward in June, the courage it had taken, the particular courage of having nothing left and making a choice anyway. She thought of Thomas, who had believed in her before she'd believed in herself. She thought of Anne, whose photograph she had found and carefully replaced, whose sewing room she was about to make her own. She thought about what it meant to belong somewhere, not to have been placed there, not to have been rescued or installed or accommodated, but to have arrived through your own will and worked your way into the fabric of a place until you were part of its pattern. Ethan turned from the fence and saw her standing there. He crossed the yard toward her in that unhurried, purposeful way of his, and the evening light was behind him, and the mountain was behind that, and he walked toward her the way he did everything, with full attention, without doubt. He stopped in front of her. "You staying for supper?" he said. She laughed. A real laugh. The first real, unguarded laugh she had produced in longer than she could remember. It came out of her before she could moderate it, and she let it go, and it felt like something being released that had been held tight for too long. "I'm staying considerably longer than supper," she said. He almost smiled, that full, almost smile that was more honest than most people's complete ones. "Good," he said. "I'll put the coffee on." He went inside. Clara stood in the yard of the mountain ranch in the September evening, and the cattle were settled on the north pasture, and the horses were in the barn, and the documentation that had changed the shape of the valley below was filed and permanent and could not be unmade. And the man inside was putting the coffee on, which he had done every morning since the second day she was here, which he had done every evening she'd worked late, which was as close as Ethan Callahan came to saying, "This is where you belong." She had walked out of a town before sunrise with $23 and nowhere to go. She had asked for a place beside a fire. She had built everything else herself. And that, all of it, the hard and the real and the earned and the chosen, was exactly enough,